Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com. Here in the bunker, high above the hills of Providence, La Prove, the naked city, the city of, well, about 300,000 stories. Here we sit with our spirit animals, Spiro Agnew and Dick Cheney, advancing the cause of civil liberties in an outrage porn-free environment everywhere. Joining us tonight is someone who is well beyond a repeat offender here on the show. At this point, his level of recidivism is reaching epic chronic levels. You'll also note that if you look over past videos, I've grown as a man since he started here, and he needs a haircut. And of course, I'm talking about Professor Andy Hernandez. He is a professor of Latin American Studies at your Western New Mexico University. I always have to give at least a brief snippet of how we met. Last year we were down in Deming, New Mexico on what's called the Deming Project in libertarian circles. We had spent a couple days at a border facility, a privately run border refugee center, doing a fabulous job of providing hot meals and hot showers, food, basic medical attention to folks who had, in some cases, walked, driven thousands of miles to get to the United States, to get to the Promised Land. Having an opportunity to speak to and I won't define him as an academic per se, although he's a very accomplished academic, but someone who's a member of the community, who is active in the community both at the civic and religious level, at the same time teaching an astonishing array of courses over at the university, including one of my favorites, which now that we've got our studio facility up, is perhaps if we move a little bit out of the COVID era, I'm going to ask him at some point in time to come in and give a 1 or 2 hour class on the drug wars. But literally his expertise covers an entire range of subjects surrounding this border presence, and ranging from, if you will, the history of Texas, New Mexico, and Mexican relationships, which is quite sordid, quite violent, and also quite interesting. He talks about the drug war, and of course, as part of that, on an ongoing basis, provides us really with a boots-on-the-ground analysis of what's happening with immigration. Because despite the news cycle, despite COVID, despite any one number of issues, a presidential election, sea changes in the body politic, immigration is still one of the great challenges in the American body politic. Andy, welcome back to the Coalition. It's great to see you.
It's great to be back, Pat, and it is great to see you safe and healthy.
Yes. Let's talk about that for a second. New Mexico, particularly the southern part of New Mexico, seems for so many people to be literally a foreign experience. What's happening with COVID in the overall crisis in southern New Mexico on the border? And how has it impacted your family and professional life?
Let's start with how it's impacted my family. I am very grateful that one of my children had relocated to the area after he graduated from college last May, and he took a job teaching special education in the local school district. So
Right.
I had him home instead of in Florida, which is Florida's becoming, competing to become a hotspot right now. As we speak. I had a daughter in grad school in Houston and my youngest son studying physics off in Los Angeles. Gratefully, they've both come home so that they're here with us as well. So I have two of my children in the house right now, along with my wife. There was a surreal moment about a week ago where my shared home office was district court while my wife was pleading in a case for children, youth, and families. I was in the common area trying to take part in an academic meeting. My daughter had a political science seminar, engaged in intense debate on the far side of one far side of the house, and youngest kid had a physics lab going on the other far side of the house. So internet is not always high speed here, but we're grateful that we had enough to get through that afternoon, and that's kind of what life is like for my family right now.
Yeah, it's and that's such a shared experience, although perhaps at not so high a level in most families. But again, that's learning has come. My wife, full disclosure, teaches third grade kiddos, and it's pretty funny to watch as I caught just a couple of snippets of all these wriggly little, great little kids, basically just about doing handstands while they're learning in their bedrooms, which of course, if you're in third grade, your bedroom is the coolest place alive. And at one point, they even had the chance to share their bedroom, to show it off to people, and that was high drama for these kiddos. It was it's sweet and funny and a little poignant at the same time, I would say,
right?
Because I would some show I would love to talk to you about what it was like to grow up in a place like New Mexico. I mean, it's got to be it had to have been an astonishing experience, particularly so long ago for guys like you and I, right?
Sometimes it feels like that. I grew up in Louisiana, but
okay.
But my children did grow up here, and it's remarkable to kind of see the differences.
Mm-hmm. Because Deming, which is very much it's a fascinating place, because on one hand, as an outsider, I can say it's very much your typical American town, except instead of a marching band, the college has a mariachi band. There's a very strong presence of Mexican culture. Obviously, it's in the DNA of the town, although the town is on the quote unquote New Mexico side. And again, as we always say every time we get together, the border is invisible in so many respects in your day-to-day life, yet at the same time remains a defining force. So with that in mind, under what's typically accorded to the Democratic side of the aisle, the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, it would appear our president, El Presidente, Mr. Trump, or as we call him here, Cheeto, is engaged in some COVID-related, although it should be unrelated, nefarious activities. What's happening here? What's going on at the border right now?
Well, one of the more remarkable things, the border wall construction has continued because that was regarded as an infrastructure project. And so construction was continuing. It was going to be pretty devastating for southern New Mexico, because you've been to the town of Columbus.
Right.
You have this village that doesn't have an emergency room, where the closest hospital is half an hour away, and there were going to be all of these workers coming in to start fortifying the bollard fence that's there. For reasons that still have not been made clear, fortunately, that project was brought to a halt because in a time of quarantine, the health ramifications of bringing in dozens, if not hundreds, of workers to a small community where it would be great for the economy briefly while they were eating and doing that sort of thing, but the healthcare implications were not going to be really good for us.
Right.
So at least that phase of the construction has stopped for the time being. Mm-hmm. There is construction still going on at various other parts of the border, though.
Right. So so they're not even tacitly acknowledging the impact of this health crisis on the border. It's just quietly stopped, and it shall not be spoken of.
Well, it's not that it shall not be spoken of. It's that there's a race to, as with so many things in U.S. politics, there's a race to declare blame, right? Mm-hmm. The centers that are holding migrants pending either admission or relocation, those are if you take a look at the three COVID hotspots, the three types, excuse me, of COVID hotspots in the United States right now, we're not talking about the Princess Diamond cruise ship anymore.
No.
We're not talking about things like that. As New York City comes under control, as California is getting a better handle on things there, basically it is a sad repetition of meatpacking plant, prison, nursing home, then repeat all the way down the top 100 list. And so prisons throughout the United States, just like the detention centers, you have people in exceptionally close quarters. They do not have nearly acceptable access to just basics like soap on a regular enough basis. So yes, these are becoming breeding grounds for the disease. Add to that, the United States, as it is deporting people, is not exerting high caution in determining whether or not they're COVID positive before they're put on a plane. And so, you have examples like Guatemala City, where people are essentially being screened as they're coming off, and they're being found to be coronavirus positive.
What controls what facilities? What's there to engage in some level of mitigation, interdiction, intervention? What can be done?
I honestly don't know, because for as much as we like to, as kind of a national pastime to disparage attorneys, attorneys are an important safeguard for human rights conditions.
Right.
Attorneys are being told that they have to provide their own personal protective equipment before they go meet with clients in detention centers. They're not getting. It's difficult for attorneys to get regular access anyway, and there are so many hearings that are being conducted by teleconferencing software now as it is. These are for the type of crisis that the United States and the larger world are dealing with. These are, I don't know if I won't say that it's intentionally making the situation worse, but that's definitely the effect.
We had a situation here. We're very fortunate. We're blessed here in Rhode Island, where we have an activist ACLU run by a gentleman who is seemingly engineered for the job. He manages to find attorneys routinely who are willing to tackle the near impossible. Now, of course, we have a for-profit prison here in the state, and it's become a detainee center, if you will, for deportees and folks who are in the clutches of ICE. And conditions for a relatively new facility, by the way. This is not your old 100-year-old, 150-year-old Bailey. With sewer water swelling through it. It's a relatively new facility, 15, 20 years old, something along that lines. Don't hold me to that. But no sanitation, no social distancing. Prisoners are routinely chained to each other. Prisoners occupy tiny little cells, which I guess makes the neocons and the Judge Dredd types pretty happy. But the reality is, it turns it into a petri dish, for lack of a better term, for the disease. And here you have, and this is, and I say this because I want to portray this to properly people, the Herculean effort it takes when you're fighting ICE, when you're fighting immigration, Homeland Security. It took a team of attorneys 3 weeks or so of continued effort to get two older gentlemen, quite frankly, 50s, 60s, both of whom who had issues. Immunocompromised would be the understatement. One was a severe diabetic, to whom literally exposure to COVID and being ill with COVID would be a death sentence. Now, the ACLU wasn't looking to, quote unquote, there were the misdemeanors in these people's past, a felony. They weren't looking for a free pass. They were simply looking for that which is the Supreme Court has enjoined, which is, if in fact you're incarcerated here in the United States, that you've done so with a reasonable degree of expectation of safety. And again, this would have been a death sentence. So finally, after a few weeks of concentrated effort, hours and hours and hours of legal services, these folks are freed on an ankle bracelet so that they will be returning to court. But imagine trying to do that. I mean, how is it possible to do that in a border facility where people are coming and going at will, if you will, as they go through the pipeline to prison or the pipeline into the country? How is that possible to maintain any level of safety, not only just for the refugees being processed, but as well as employees or the communities that these people are released into? What's the process there, and is there any level of safety whatsoever?
There's very little safety, and really the federal government is running out of excuses, because one of the things that the Trump administration has done is that instead of interring people who present themselves at the border to request asylum or who are caught crossing without papers, instead of interring them and working through their cases, as the United States has done previously, they're simply redeposited back in Mexico immediately. So there is no longer any type of surge, human surge, as the Border Patrol and ICE were describing it last year, where they just could not handle the capacity. Mm-hmm. These are agencies that are at an all-time high in funding and personnel and are still, I was going to say unable or unwilling, but that's a cop-out, unwilling to exercise a minimum of safety and protection of human rights.
So, in a sense, we are our own worst enemies. On a very practical sense, we are creating these environments. Again, I'll use the somewhat shop-worn at this point analogy of a petri dish, but we are creating multiple petri dishes so that these for-profit prisons, these government refugee centers, can be nothing but harbingers of gloom and death.
So to look at our foreign policy and to see how this is playing out with intentional cruelty, I mentioned planes of deportees landing in Guatemala where people are sick. Guatemala has actually refused to accept some plane loads, and they are quarantining those that they do accept. Because Guatemala has followed through on a few of its threats to not accept aircraft, even though it's still accepting many, the United States has not sent respirators to Guatemala. Honduras and El Salvador are perfectly aware that they are receiving people who are positive for the coronavirus. They're simply quarantining them as best they can. Lo and behold, Honduras and El Salvador are receiving ventilators from the federal government, from the U.S. federal government. Guatemala is now also being threatened with a reduction in foreign aid. Honduras and El Salvador are being rewarded with the continuation of foreign aid. So there's a very precise series of calculations of carrot and stick that are at work here as well.
And so literally we are creating leper colonies around Latin and Central America.
Well, we are, and I'm sure that there will be plenty of people who are surprised in the next several months when there are renewed surges of people fleeing those countries because they're hotspots for coronavirus.
So you get the dual impact of the drug war and a lethal disease all in one.
You do, and we spoke about this briefly last time too. There was a moment before our last broadcast where in one of the states in Mexico, it was one of the various cartels that was enforcing a curfew. In the time since we've talked in Mexico, one of El Chapo's daughters in the vicinity of Guadalajara has actually put their particular organization at work dispensing relief aid to people in those environs. In Nicaragua, of all places, MS-13 of all groups is actually doing what the government is not doing and is trying to set a curfew to keep people safe. In a country, Nicaragua is a country that still refuses to acknowledge any significant number of coronavirus cases. So you have a series of exceptionally perverse incentives. You have cases where when civil society is not carrying through, that it's criminal organizations that are providing relief.
So what we are literally doing, excuse me, is a microcosm of the Middle East where organizations like Hezbollah essentially replace governments and become governments in waiting which dispense justice, and I'm using the air quotes, dispense aid, so that the allegiance locally is no longer to a failed government, but you've got the prospect of a literal human allegiance to, in this case, narco-terrorism.
You know, we haven't hit the tipping point in those countries yet, but the symptoms are clear.
Right. That's,
And I'll add that Nicaragua was also such a basket case that in the run-up to Easter, the President Ortega was nowhere to be found. There was speculation that he was dead. He came out after he showed himself again after Easter, but hasn't really made extensive public comment. But there was a moment where the national police in the Capitol would see citizens with masks on and would take the masks off. You know, the United States is a diverse enough place where we will 10 years from now still be arguing whether or not masks helped at all and who should have used them and what. Right. But we don't have to worry about law enforcement. Well, I overstepped there. There are some places where people are asked to take off their masks, depending on what color you are. But we don't have a national police that's going around the Capitol taking masks off of people.
Right.
We did have those horrific cases in Illinois where black men were ejected from Walmart for wearing masks.
Wow. Yeah, you can't make this crap up. So
no, you can't.
So we are faced now with the prospect of effectively our foreign policy on 2 or 3 different levels is effectively eliminating the rule of law in a variety of client states around Central and Latin America.
It's definitely contributing to that. And I'm sure there'll be a staggering lack of self-awareness in a few years when these organizations have even more power than they have now.
Right. Because again, it's the rule of the streets. If in fact it's the criminal element that you're looking for daily sustenance to, we're talking about fundamental survival here. And now add the underdeveloped nature of the economy in these countries, and it just sweetens the pot. If you're not being able to provide basic services to the folks in your government, to the people, there is a vacuum, and that vacuum will be filled. Is there any?
It's one that,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, buddy.
It's one that drug trafficking organizations have filled all along. I mean, we can look back to the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. The major cartels in Colombia provided schools and healthcare in parts of the country that just did not see those provided as basic services by the government. Those are cases. I mean, we've kind of seen that sort of thing play out with drug trafficking organizations across the world. But in a time where we have a global crisis that's intensifying, it seems that this trickle down was the wrong word to use. We're seeing that this collateral effect also seems to be intensifying. Mm-hmm. I mean, think for a moment, MS-13 is the boogeyman that's constantly trotted out, right?
Right.
And imagine for a moment that they are providing a service in a country in Central America, and that's not triggering a reaction on our part.
Mm. So now you also have, as it's been widely reported, that President Trump is issuing executive orders, a total moratorium, if you will, on immigration. What practical impact does that have?
Well, one of the first is that one of the fascinating things about the Trump administration is that the initial Twitter announcements don't ever quite match with what actually comes out. Mm-hmm. So there are some categories of people who will still be able to enter the United States.
Right.
But the long-term effect for us is going to be that as this policy is taking shape, it's going to be low-paid workers, and we're not going to be able to continue to attract the best and brightest in healthcare and in STEM research and in those areas. So, the United States, if you take a look just at things, for example, like if you take a look at just the sheer number of patents or the sheer amount of intellectual property that's created by the music industry or the motion picture industry, when you're turning away the world's best and brightest and trying to emphasize low-wage workers, that's going to have a clear effect on your economy 5, 10, 15, and 20 years down the road.
Mm-hmm. So we are also being met with and struggling with the agricultural and meat processing industries in this nation. The disruptions in the supply chain as a result of Corona pale in comparison to the potential supply chain disruptions that happen in this potential for this complete shutdown. What he's using as essentially the reason for this is he really trying to conflate the advent of Corona with the immigration issue?
I know that we can say for absolute certainty that advisors like Steve Miller are. I mean, there's just a demonstrable track record there already, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the lead up to this, quite a bit was made of the major raids that ICE conducted in the meat processing industry last fall.
Right.
One of the plants in Mississippi was one of the most notable cases. The interesting thing is that the meat packing industry has been one that has been actively recruiting immigrants for decades. And while frequently it is actively recruiting immigrants who are documented, the simple fact is when you look at ICE raids, there are an enormous number of undocumented workers there as well. But the federal government has, of course, this is the whole crux of the various philosophies of the political parties, right? The federal government has enormous coercive power. What's remarkable about the raids last fall, if we take the one in Mississippi, for example, it's not that all of a sudden that people discovered that there were undocumented workers there. It's that this was the canary in the coal mine. Workers were attempting to organize and unionize because of unsafe working conditions. And the use of ICE as an enforcement arm to break the organization of labor might have been great for the profit margins for the meatpacking industry, but the meatpacking industry is faced front and center right now, day after day, with the fact that in some states they are responsible for the largest single areas of outbreak. Because as the infrastructure of that industry is set right now, it's very difficult to have social distancing. It's very difficult with the way that the facilities are set up. It's not really conducive to the significant use of personal protective equipment. Right. And so essentially, these industries, in the case of the plant in Mississippi, have effectively been coddled with the stick of the federal government available to try to break the power of labor to challenge those conditions. Mm-hmm. The coronavirus does not care who is on the side of the meatpacking plants in these working conditions. It's thriving in the places that allow those conditions.
Right. When you're looking at 700 and 800 people being sick in a meatpacking plant, and you close the border, is there any discussion with the government whatsoever to bridge those two gaps?
Well, there's going to be a direct connection simply because of how frequently undocumented workers are working in the farming and meat processing industries. However, even as the Trump administration has tightened the number of visas that are granted in many areas, these have been sectors of the economy that have been favored with the continued granting of visas for people to cross to work. So the degree to which under normal conditions labor would have been available would have been fine. It's that we're at the point now where there are workers all across the country, whether they're citizens or immigrants with visas or immigrants who are undocumented. Everybody's making their own internal analysis of how much are they willing to work under unsafe conditions. And what the meatpacking industry is showing us is that we're crossing a threshold where even the people who have been consigned to working under the most dangerous conditions are getting to the point where they're not willing to continue to do so.
One of the interesting points you sent me was that ICE itself is doing reviews of some of the immigrant deaths. In and of itself is raising concerns about care. COVID-19 care. How is ICE reacting to its own reviews? And we're talking about facilities here in the United States.
We are. I think there's a considerable degree of self-interest involved here because ICE agents can take as many precautions as possible. But the simple fact is that if they're working around large populations that are positive, there's going to be a minor mistake that's going to have lots of people left infected. It's also difficult to quantify the problem looking at it from the outside, though, because there's an interesting mechanic at work here. When ICE talks about how many of its agents and staff have tested positive for the coronavirus, they're only considering formal employees. They're not considering people who contract with ICE. And if you look at how the labor market has evolved over the past decades, there's every sector of the economy. If you ignore the people who are contract labor, you're ignoring a significant amount of the workforce.
Right.
So anytime ICE is talking about X number of agents or staff infected, you can multiply that by the number of untested contractors or contractors who have been tested but aren't being counted.
Okay. So effectively, another example of our immigration policy creating a public health crisis or taking one and bringing it to an entirely different level.
That's definitely an area of self-inflicted mistakes.
How could this? Are we talking about simple common sense here? Is that what's missing?
To some degree, that's it. But to some degree, there's also the political calculus of it doesn't matter. Some administrations would have behaved more responsibly than others, but no administration wants to see a high number of people infected with or dying from a pandemic.
Right.
And we can't just blame the Trump administration here, even though they are clearly at fault to varying degrees, because various state governments are also doing their best are also fudging how they're making calculations. Mm-hmm. The Miami Herald just ran a story yesterday about how the Department of Health operating in the Tampa Bay area has a much higher tally of people who are positive for the coronavirus than the state of Florida itself does. But the state of Florida exerted pressure on the city of Tampa Bay, and now Tampa Bay is using the state's official numbers, which are significantly lower.
Sounds like a president in a cruise ship. The truth will out itself. Is this a twofold attempt to A, blame immigrants, while B, at the same time stem the fear that the public will run amok based on what the reality of these numbers are?
Well, it's just human nature to try to find somebody to blame, right? I mean, the administration has put a significant amount of effort trying to blame China for the outbreak itself, for how the outbreak is spread across the world. It presents an interesting contradiction because, on the one hand, the administration maintains that it has responded effectively, but on the other hand, that it was duped into under-responding to the crisis because it was misled by China. So, I mean, immigration is another target here to blame. There is a national calculus in which blue states are pitted against red states for the degree to which they need a bailout, when the reality is that it doesn't matter what color the state is. Every state's suffering under this. But it is just part of the larger political calculation of trying to shift blame somewhere else.
And that has gone on since the dawn of time.
This is nothing new. I think what personalizes it, of course, is that we're living it.
Right.
It's an exercise that I've put on many students in many of my classes. Keep a diary. I'll give you credit for it, for the course. But imagine that your diary is a primary source 50 years from now, and people are trying to understand what it was like to live in 2020. Because the simple fact is, for historians especially, it's one thing to write about these crisis situations, but it's quite another thing entirely to be living through one.
And that is the actual challenge here, because as we live through this, are we intellectually honest enough as a body politic to address the real issues? I mean, it's abundantly obvious that both sides, in terms of political leadership, don't get that we're well beyond, or should be well beyond, caring about red or blue. I mean, that three months into this, that there's still political calculations being made when it should be a question of survival calculations, shows how unsuited most of our political leadership is for high office. And that's both sides. There's no heroes here. There's no awards and courage coming out from any of this. I don't think. I mean, if you can point to me to someone in government who is working hard to depoliticize this, and I mean at the political level, clearly there are civil servants working tirelessly, first responders working tirelessly to address this. But are there any political heroes out there?
I'm looking for one, and I would love for somebody to give me one. Among other things, though, we're dealing with decades worth of inertia here. Mm-hmm. All other things being equal, how could it possibly make sense that hospitals are laying off doctors and nurses right now?
Right.
And put simply, the balance sheets for so many of these organizations were tied to elective procedures that people are not choosing to or unable to by state regulation to have done right now. So you have a healthcare system that is besieged by this crisis. We have an economic system where, yes, there's been some hoarding of toilet paper, but just-in-time delivery and the mechanisms of logistics have ensured that that industry is operated as lean as possible, and they can't turn the mega rolls for industry into individual rolls of Charmin that are UPC coded to sell at Target for all of us.
Right.
The meatpacking industry is doing something similar. There are so many elements of our society that were geared towards an entirely different life that just are breaking down right now.
Right.
It's the same problem where the idea of the privatization of prisons, it's been a great way for states to make money. It's brought plenty of money into community coffers, but it's also incentivized incarceration. And going back now to those hotspots, we'll alternate our packing plants with our nursing homes with our prisons.
And creating havoc in the family structures of so many of the working poor. I mean, that to me, the challenge in terms of maintaining civil order is there a breaking point? And you know, I mean, I've always been a little bit more apocalyptic than you are. You're much more reasonable and optimistic. But at what point in time, because cities across America, including Providence, you've seen governments hell-bent to make sure that life in the suburbs continues somewhat, with great concern about whether or not we can use the beach, where the hotspots in so many American cities are, in fact, in the urban core amongst the working poor, whose conditions are exacerbated by poor health care, close living, as is so often in the inner city, and in an unexpected irony, the fact that so many of those folks live in direct, or work, I should say, in direct contact in patient care.
So this is definitely an urban problem, but it's not restricted to that, because the most painful thing that New Mexico is facing right now is that the Navajo are being devastated by this outbreak. And you cannot look at the Navajo. There's no conceptualization of the Navajo reservation that makes you think you're dealing with an urban area, but all of those factors apply. And the sheer poverty, you know, I appreciate the kind things that you've said about my classes on all of our different appearances here. There are times that the material I teach takes a mental toll on me. You know, there are only so many research papers on the Mayan genocide that you can read every semester before it takes you to a pretty dark place itself. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, you know, there are a lot of historians who have, you know, encouraging students to keep diaries, giving them credit for it. Reading these entries has really rubbed my nose in the problems that you're talking about. Because to live at a time where a high school student who is enrolled in your class for dual credit and is working full time at a fast food place to help to help her family put money on the table, where she's defined as an essential worker, there are serious problems there. Where she is exposed to danger, where she has limited access to the care that she's going to need. Those are signs that there are a lot of broken things that we have to come to face with.
Not the least of which, of course, is the notion that, and it's issue been debated extensively here in Rhode Island and worked on, is getting employers to understand, particularly in food-oriented industries or in healthcare-oriented industries, that availability of sick time is a critical component, because we are reintroducing the illness all the time if, in fact, we're not allowing folks the simple ability to go home and be well.
Right. And to keep picking on the meatpacking industry, because frankly, they have it coming, there are processors that have what they call responsibility incentives, where if you showed up for the entire month of April, you were given a reasonable bonus. That's anything but responsible, because you're incentivizing people showing up to work sick.
Right, and that financial incentive is very often the difference between life and death for these folks.
Right.
The difference between having shelter, having food. It's confounding, because on one level, the blockage, if you will, of free market capitalism in our healthcare industry has cost us so much in terms of capacity. Yet at the same time, the lack of recognition by some of those players and understanding what the health implications are on because of financial decisions is also chilling.
It can be, and it's let's take a look at Europe for a moment. Even in the context of the EU, Germany has been made fun of for decades, even by other EU nations, because of how much, by every quote reasonable metric, they had too many ICU beds, they had too many doctors, they had too many nurses. Well, in a normal year they did, but Germany's economy isn't tanking right now, and their healthcare industry is coping reasonably effectively right now. They are doing better essentially than any other major nation in Europe.
That which has made us so financially strong has exposed its weak points. Again, just-in-time manufacturing. That seems to be supply chain management. If there's a bogeyman, it's not the fact that folks are looking to leave war-torn, narco-terrorism-torn countries. It's the fact that we've lived on the thin ice for so long. We've so highly automated that we eliminated any sort of human failure into our systems.
Well, we've also turned it into an area for blame, right? Because how often have Americans who are poor essentially been subject to blame for being one paycheck away from being homeless?
Right.
And yet, how many corporations are lined up for bailout money right now because apparently they can't go a month with reduced earnings?
That was particularly stunning to me. When you look at the airlines, who for a number of years has literally enjoyed record earnings. And when you look at a company like Apple Computer, which has hoarded cash, sometimes to the frustration of their stockholders, I mean, tens of billions of dollars of cash, who is ultimately going to survive, except for the lack of any moral hazard for these companies routinely coming back to the trough for more money. There's been a couple of amusing memes, I'm sure you've seen them on the internet, where airline ads that say, "We're here for you," are conflated with, "Oh yeah, when my bag was 2 pounds heavy, you needed $75. You weren't exactly here for me."
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
It's funny, but it's illustrative. of just. I'm sorry. Go ahead, buddy.
No, please go ahead.
No, it's illustrative of how out of touch these companies are with moral hazard. They'll think nothing, if you will, of coming up to this. This money. We've gone in a generation, and I'm old enough to remember when Chrysler and Lee Iacocca borrowed money from the government. And it was considered the marketing coup of its day that Iacocca was such a good manager and such a good CEO that he paid it off early. And it was celebrated. And they gained market share and were celebrated by the consumer because they had paid it off early. Now, come full circle, and we're looking at companies who think nothing of going to a beleaguered nation and asking them to print money. And then on top of that, essentially take on a technicality in a small business loan program. Their appetite for other people's money, as in, government and the people's money, is so voracious and so stone-hearted that they're incapable of even, I think, discerning right versus wrong in this point, or what's appropriate or what's ethical. I mean, the Los Angeles Lakers, really.
And of course, there are so many distractions. I mean, if we look back at blame for a moment, I mentioned toilet paper hoarding earlier. When the shelves were and in some places they still are, out of toilet paper. Everybody is so in such crisis mode that it was something that we should have completely anticipated, because with so much of the workforce operating from home right now, it's the simple mechanic of people not being in an office for 8 hours and instead being at home for those 8 hours. And yes, they're going to use more toilet paper. And especially if your kids are away and they come home, or if you're quarantining in small groups. These were things this was something that was relatively easy to see coming if there wasn't such a panic. And yet, to go back to memes for a moment, or social media, or just conventional wisdom, if you can't find toilet paper on the shelf, it's because of hoarders, right?
Right. We've also changed as a nation how we spend money almost overnight. You've got, if you've got money, and that's an important distinction here. Up until 3 months ago, even if you were poor, but you had money, you could go buy necessities. You could. You might pay too much because of what they call a food desert, an absence of supermarkets or large chains in your immediate community. You might make poor choices because of educational issues in terms of what you should be eating. But ultimately, if you had $20 in your pocket, you could go out and buy a couple meals. And you could buy vegetables and fruits in small cans. Now we've completely shifted. I'm blessed that I'm not poor. I'm not, money's very tight, like in most American families right now. But at least I've got a few extra bucks, so that if when I go shopping now, you don't go shopping with a list as to what you want to buy. You are now mentally prepared to select the best, if you will, from what you can find.
Yes.
So if you've got money and you're out there and all of a sudden you stumble on a cache of toilet paper or disinfectant or any number of supplies that are in shortage, you're going to buy them whether you need them right away or not. And you don't look at yourself as a hoarder, because that's the guy who the guy in Tennessee who bought, a storage unit full of a cleanser, then went to the New York Times and said, I don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times, but here's what we've done. And perhaps one of the great moments exposing American stupidity. I mean, it's funny, but it's tragicomic.
It's funny because we need something to laugh at right now.
Right. But it's the average everyday person who, like me, say I leave here and I go to the store, and all of a sudden, somehow a case of toilet paper popped up. The store is going to limit me to 2, but you're darn straight I'm going to take 2, even if I don't need it. So we've altered the way that people look at consumerism.
We have, and we're still penalizing the poorest, because those are the people who are most likely to be in a job that is declared essential, but is not only considered essential, but it is likely a low-wage job where they must still work with the public.
Right. And the
And on
CNA,
top of that,
Mhm.
go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and the CNAs, as they now call them, we call them nurses' aides back in the day. The people who are on the front line of the duct tape that holds together the mess that is the American medical system, who very often are using rideshare to get to jobs in failed urban transit systems, who spend 2 or 3 hours a day, because it's awfully, as I tell people all the time, it's really expensive to be broke. Really
Right.
expensive. So the notion, if you will, that those folks who live in the most crowded conditions, who have the least money to spend on medical care as well as potentially healthy diets, are the people who are literally changing the sheets, the bedpans, prepping people who are very, very ill with this disease for advanced medical care. And in many hospitals across the country, they don't have the necessary tools to be safe doing it.
Right. It's terrifyingly true. And one of the things that's been exposed about the nursing home industry, there are so many places where these are also not just low wage jobs, but essentially minimum wage jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have workers who make a living by working at multiple nursing homes.
Right.
That is, I mean, if you asked coronavirus to create a structure where it could thrive, that might be what it would put together for you.
Right. Exhausted. I will tell you, as I've told you before, and I tell people, I use this analogy on the show because I learned so much while doing it. Didn't realize it at the time, but it gave me a unique insight into urban life. So I drove Lyft for 2 years while my 2 daughters were simultaneously in college. Real eye-opener. I would often drive in what some folks describe as the most dangerous parts of Providence, Rhode Island. I never had a problem. We don't carry cash, but people were genuinely kind, even in difficult situations. There were times I didn't even see it until it was too late because I probably wouldn't have taken it. A crumpled up dollar bill from a woman who was leaving one nursing home or one home care facility or one extended care facility and I would literally drive her to the next one. Because the while the sum total of their hours might be 60 or 70, they were very careful at each home to make sure that these people were classified as part-time employees.
Exactly.
And these are women. More often than not, they were women. More often than not, they were in their 50s or early 60s. They had the work ethic of a different generation and just literally worked themselves into a grave. Now, add on a highly communicable deathly virus, and you have a recipe for disaster.
You do. And to look at my field, you have, frankly, some educational leaders who are saying some horrifically irresponsible things right now. I hope that my university administration isn't watching right now because I'm actually going to credit them with way more common sense and smarts than with their peers at other institutions. But for the president of Stanford yesterday to say that, well, we should go ahead and return to campus in the fall, and in order to be able to socially distant, we'll put students in tents on the quad. How desperate are you to return to a world that was not at its best in the first place, that you think that somebody's going to pay for a Stanford education and accept that they need to be sleeping in a tent on the quad?
How desperate was it for Harvard to not just to accept an initial award of the earliest business relief fund, but to calculate, and so people separate that from a very simple fact. Senior management, if you will, at Harvard thought it was appropriate to even apply. I mean, you want to talk about intellectual... Yeah, $60 billion endowment.
Atop their multi-billion-dollar endowment.
Right. I'm thinking that the endowment, and this is not a shot at your university, but I'm thinking the endowment at Harvard is probably a little bigger than at Western New Mexico.
It's significantly bigger, but our folks don't waste it either.
Well, there you go. you guys, by all accounts, turn out a high-quality education for people in your community. And you, from what I've read, you graduate, as they say, people with skills to pay the bills, while at the same time retaining at least, a high level of liberal arts. And that's a difficult challenge these days because, everybody's supposed to become a coder. But again, our nation's universities are so tone deaf, and that's being polite, that the larger ones think that, they should have a piece of that pie. That because it's, what's the old line? Because it's just because you can, maybe you shouldn't. Go ahead, buddy.
No, I mean, you're right, but it's an element of the higher education has its prestige sector just as surely as any other sector of the economy. And there are cases, nobody needs to spend $75,000 a year on an education to become a teacher or a nurse. There are so many exceptional schools that you can attend in-state to do that. I can understand the prestige. I was fortunate enough to go to Texas Christian University for my bachelor's. I understand the attraction of prestige, and I have no regrets about going to that school or the networks and opportunities that it opened up for me. Those were good years for me. But there is a prestige pricing sector of the education economy that does not stand up very well right now when having to go to online education is becoming a great equalizer.
It absolutely is. Let me ask you a question about that then. Now, you work with the mission of most state colleges, many of which have become state universities, is to educate individuals for a pretty interesting cross-section of the community. You're aiming to take folks out of the city, it's geared towards taking regular folks and give them a strong academic background so that they can compete in a variety of industries, as opposed to perhaps one of these more esoteric research-based universities or, as you pointed out, that elite subgroup. So you're dealing with great students, great kids from regular places and regular schools, and you're taking that clay and trying to mold it. Now, ultimately, the skills and the talent necessary to do that have to be higher level in certain respects. Because, there are plenty of state universities, particularly at the community college level, which engage in a great deal of remedial work. And then they go on to the state universities like yours, perhaps after spending a year or two or matriculating at a community college, and then they're able to compete and they're able to study at much higher levels. Are we resourcing them properly at a time like this?
Yeah.
Because, and are we placing them directly in the target because you're facing the imminent collapse of so many state and municipal budgets?
Go ahead. There are federal decisions that are actively working against higher education right now. Just for starters, when we take a look at the stimulus money that some families are receiving, if you have a college-age kid, whether they are independent and working, or there are very few conditions under which a college student would have qualified for stimulus money. Now, they have to eat, they have to pay for housing, they have to, there are very few college students who aren't paying for some portion of their education, but they were completely left out of that. But even with the CARE funding that was put together to help various universities and community colleges across the country, students who are immigrants are excluded from that. Even though DACA students are now registered with the federal government, they are excluded from that. So we have a system that's essentially continuing to penalize in as many ways possible vulnerable people.
And so the cycle will continue, the vicious cycle. And again, as resources disappear because of bloated municipal budgets with poor priorities, we're going to be leaving some people out in the cold. And it all comes down to, I was going to say, it all is tied indirectly to this crazy set of immigration laws, this crazy war on drugs, and the explosion, if you will, of the public economy as opposed to private. All of that combined, and all of that's fixable. Again, we get back to the same resolution when we talk every month. It's all fixable. Eliminate barriers to trade.
For any part of it being fixed in the near future.
Right. But eliminate barriers to trade. Increase the ability to exchange ideas, commerce, and individuals around borders, so that the market allows people the opportunity to seek alternatives that, as opposed to that which they were born into and now are artificially restricted to. Now, in the presence of all this chaos, you've got a president, and we started touching on this a little earlier. Let's get back to that for a second. You've got a president who is clearly looking to assess blame to this. Now, the people at the Washington Post and the New York Times and probably the Boston Globe editorial departments are raging against it. You have folks like us who are, in your case, you literally are an expert on a lot of these issues, and you're raging against it. Is there any part of other society that's raging against this, that sees the exigent danger that this represents, or are they simply willing to follow along and follow the narrative that, immigrants, these people must be the reason why we're doing it. It must be somebody else's fault. Do you see any reaction to that other than the circles that you and I just discussed?
I do, but some of it's counterproductive. To some degree, there's a segment of American society that is just simply contrarian, right? That it doesn't matter who we're talking about here, that there would be a contrarian streak that this situation would evoke in them. It's decidedly counterproductive, though, to have people burn energy on demanding that all of the restrictions on social distancing be reversed, that we open up much more quickly than we should, and that sort of thing.
Right.
That's a bit painful to watch right now, especially because I have so many members of my family who have been deemed essential, who are exposed. Ultimately, their health, their wellness, etc., have the potential to be exposed. Whether they're essential workers in the fast food industry, or essential workers in the healthcare industry, or essential workers in other sectors, they should not be subject to greater risk now than everybody else, and yet they are. As far as folks who are calling attention to some of the worst issues right now, I have found it very productive for me. I've tried to limit my social media engagement, but I sure do follow a whole lot more nurses and doctors than I ever did before. And the folks who are living this on the front lines are talking about it on a daily basis. And I think that we'd all be much better people to be listening to what they have to say when we start to think about what the world is going to look like in a year or 2 years. And I think the other piece, too, the other group that I really wish would get more attention, there are too many times in the U.S. where we thank people for their service and are convinced there's enough. When we say thank you, it should be with cash, not with we appreciate it. So
thoughts and prayers.
The person who's packing our groceries, the person who's preparing our food, the people who are out there still serving under these conditions deserve more than thank you for your service when this is all said and done.
Absolutely. How do you think this all turns out in November? We're starting to get close. Will Trump pay the price for this? Will Trump are people going to see through his attempts to demonize people at the border? Can we help?
I don't know how much of an issue immigration will end up being in the 2020 election, simply because the numbers have fallen so sharply. It was one thing when there was nonstop coverage of caravans and hundreds of thousands of people trying to cross. But the simple fact that the U.S. is not even admitting, is returning people immediately and is trying to return as many people who have made it into the country as possible. I'm not sure. I'm not going to say that people aren't going to try to make it an issue. I'm not sure how effective an issue it's going to be.
Right.
But I'm not sure the president has been made who can run with tens of millions of people being unemployed and with significant contractions of the economy, and can actually be able to muster off reelection. So the only area I'm cautious in saying that right now is that it's May, and if these conditions are still there in October, it's going to be very difficult for the president to be reelected.
I don't know if you had much of a chance to see this because it's really broken in the last 3 or 4 days, and the Libertarian, I'm not sure that the Libertarian Party carries its rightful role at the head of the news cycle, but you do have actually, this is an interesting moment in American history. For the first time, there is a sitting Libertarian who has declared that to these Congress of the United States, a sitting Libertarian in the United States Congress. I'm not sure if you were aware of that.
I am. I'm actually a big fan of Justin Amash.
Okay.
He's said quite a few things that really appeal to me, even before the past few days.
Mm-hmm. And what are those? Where do you find him attractive as a candidate?
Let's just look for a moment at how the federal government has responded to the pandemic in terms of bailouts and stimulus. Amash was the one screaming the loudest that there had to be very careful conditions put on bailout money for businesses so that big corporations did not take advantage of it. Mm-hmm. That looks positively prophetic right now.
Right.
He was the person who was saying that American families should be getting $2,000 a month, not this one-time $1,200 amount that many have not even received at this point. Mm-hmm. I think he was very prophetic when it came to what a stimulus package should look like. And I hope that more people are seeing that as these things are actually unfolding in front of us. He has taken numerous positions, though, on foreign policy that I found attractive, not just in terms of immigration, but in terms of the U.S. stance on the threshold for intervention in other parts of the world. So I'll admit I'm curious as he stakes out a platform for a presidency.
It's interesting. That's a source of contention because as the Libertarian Party, we have a platform, and it's actually a very important part of our lives. It's something that's argued over, contested, debated, ruminated. It's an important part of our philosophy and our movement. And he roiled some people by saying, he wasn't sure yet where the libertarian philosophy or not so much the philosophy, but our statement of principles and our beliefs matched his, which is interesting for someone who's running as a candidate for president of our organization. And libertarians are very, very focused on the platform. It's the most, ironically, in many ways, it's on a normal convention year when there's 1,300 of us in one room somewhere, it's usually the most contentious part of the convention, not the presidential nomination. So it's going to be interesting to see the impact on that because there will be a little bit of a tug of war. He will bring Republicans with him into the movement, and there will be that sort of, if you're trying to reinvent us as the Republican Party, don't. Many folks like me, for example, he does believe in some government structure at the border. Call me a hopeless optimist. I don't really believe in borders anymore. I've kind of completed that journey this year. And part of it was actually the time I spent in Deming. Because the notion that a group of men and maybe in the future women will arbitrarily draw a line, literally in the sand in this case, and that will in effect become the litmus test for what type of liberty and what type of future you're given. I have a problem with.
It's interesting that you described it as an arbitrary line in the sand. I don't know, when you were out here, I don't know if you had a chance to see the customs house kind of in the middle of town.
Yeah.
It seems like a bizarrely named structure, but it's there because that was the 1848 border. The present border came along a few years later after the Gadsden Purchase. So, I mean, even that line has moved over a relatively short span.
Yeah. Which points to its intransigence as well as its irrelevance in some levels. Because ultimately, any student at any level, even a basic one like me, of economics understands that there's no such thing as a border in economics. That border may be represented in the form of a tariff or a tax or a place that you have to stop and transfer title to something. But the reality is there's no such thing as, and it became clear to me that, you've got Columbus and you've got Deming. Is there a real border there? Well, of course there is from a physical standpoint, but clearly the economics of these communities, there's a great deal of wealth transfer back and forth literally on a daily basis, on a momentary basis. Right now as we're speaking.
There is. And, it takes me back. I'll paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me, but President Reagan basically spoke about a nation without borders wasn't a nation. And yet we take a look at how different border barriers are being put up, and the United States is surrendering sovereignty because any barrier is not being built exactly at the border. It's actually being built slightly on the U.S. side, or in some cases, much further on the U.S. side. So we've had these ridiculous incidents where U.S. Agents, or in some cases military personnel in Texas, were on the opposite side of the wall because the conventional thinking would be that the wall is the border. They were apprehended by the Federalists because they were on the wrong side of the border. Well, they were actually still in U.S. territory, but it gets confusing because they were on the wrong side of the wall.
Right.
There are communities in Texas that are on the wrong side of the wall, at least in terms of what you would conventionally think is the United States versus what you would think is Mexico. Those are political decisions that the United States is actively making right now that are showing just how arbitrary the concept of a border can be in some cases.
Absolutely. And therein, my friend, lies the great irony of all this. That for all the Sturm und Drang, for all the arguments, for all the litigation, for the wars, for all of that, it is completely arbitrary. And will change. And will react to events, some current, some, years in the past. And then we will repeat. And until we become a post-border world, we are doomed to suffer. It's this notion of having to root for laundry because of some ideological or perhaps romantic attachment to the only thing I think that I've ever agreed with Donald Trump was they may have been talking about Iran, they may have been talking about whichever quote-unquote rogue state as we define them. And in a rare moment of introspection, he actually kind of somberly looked out at the crowd and said, our hands aren't so clean either. And that talk was quickly shot down by Trumpers who kind of poo-pooed it as, wouldn't be prudent. But he said it.
What he really meant was, or at least that's a sentiment that I hear a lot.
Right. Well, how do we do tonight? Do we solve the world's problems?
I don't think so, but you're not going to solve them if you don't know what they are first. So I think we at least made some progress there.
Okay. What do you think? I kind of raised this idea in the beginning. Sometime I don't know when's a good time, and I don't know how often you teach this course, but could we do an hour course? Just literally teach a course over the line like this, and for an hour or maybe twice on the drug wars.
Let me put some thought into it, but it's certainly possible. Let me put some thoughts into how it would be structured and how we carry it out.
Yeah, just kind of a review, something that people could audit. I think there would be a great deal of appeal, and I think it's something that ultimately you could even market at some point. Because the even in the first time we talked about it, which seems like an eternity ago, so many months ago, clearly Americans, not just their attitude, but their behavioral approach to education has changed dramatically in the last 90 days. It has come in I've always been fascinated by the American consumer's ability to turn on a dime. And that which would have been thought just, I don't know, not taken seriously, the notion that you could have family events over Zoom. And how'd you like to be a stockholder in Zoom, right? But but the thought that you could do that, people would not that you couldn't, but that people would be interested in doing things like that from an electronic perspective was not even in the realm of possibility. Yet in the space of 90 days, we have an entire generation of kooky little tots who spend part of the day standing on their head in front of a screen, communicating with their tot friends by a couple of harried, exhausted teachers trying to herd cats, and somehow accomplishing things with these kiddos. Because kiddos, by definition, are curious and they want to learn until certain types of public education have beat it out of them. So
it is remarkable.
Yeah.
It is remarkable because, talking with people in the community right now, it's the elementary teachers who seem to be having the most meaningful interactions with students at the moment, at least in the K-12 structure.
Right. Absolutely. Well,
I was just hearing that from a colleague yesterday.
No, I'd love you to consider that, though. Somehow, if we can do that, maybe in the next round.
Actually, I will, because when you get down to it, you've talked about it. The realm of what is possible has changed so much in the last few months.
Right. That I'm convinced that there's a lot of people who would love to get an overview like that. And then if you whet their appetite, then it would be interesting to see as a model how far you professionally could do it. Because the other notion is to a certain degree, I would love to understand what the impact on, for example, professional sports is going to be. I've seen, and this is anecdotal, I've seen plenty of guys testify that, in the absence of sports, all of a sudden they're spending time, professional televised sports, they're spending lots of more time with their kids, just doing other things.
Right.
And maybe this was this sort of adjustment that had to, this sort of mid-course adjustment that had to take place. Maybe this is what realigns people in their priorities. I'd love to see what impact this is going to have. I wish I could. I wish I could have some type of vision into the future to see things like gardening, at-home projects. Is it something that is quickly cast aside when things go back to normal, whatever that might be? I mean, that to me is going to tell me a lot about the strength of the American character. Not that I'm anti-sports. I love kicking back and watching a game, but whether or not we become in contact with our institutions again, whether we religion.
I'm just curious. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious. 2 years from now, how many people are still going to be shaking hands?
Oh, I think that's done.
But I also did have a colleague did point out to me, and I think there's a regrettable amount of truth to this. In 30 years, today's children are going to be giving their grandparents Clorox wipes for their birthday every year, and the kids are not going to understand why grandma and grandpa keep doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to leave you with, I think, one of my favorite quotes on that note. It's actually Orwell, and it's from 1984. And to me, it actually it speaks more to what the point of the novel was, as people became obsessed over the notion that Big Brother was watching you. So you remember the proles, of course, were as you know, but if audience people or people listen to this in a time capsule in the future, reflect, the proles were the ordinary working class, if you will. And in talking about just this very issue, and this reflects so much on folks' intellectual curiosity, folks' willingness to settle, how they invest their days and their time, how much they're allowed to, or they allow other people to control them. So I'm just going to leave with a quote from George Orwell. So long as the proles continued to work and breed, their other activities were without importance. Left to themselves, like cattle turned loose upon the plains of Argentina, they had reverted to a style of life that appeared to be natural to them, a sort of ancestral pattern. Heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbors, films, football, beer, and above all, gambling filled up the horizon of their minds. To keep them in control was not difficult. I find those words right now to be absolutely chilling. Close us out, Professor. How can we find out more about you, and what are your thoughts on those words?
I think that 1984 is highly necessary to read and very painful to read right now. I picked it up again in 2015, and it meant a lot more to me than it did in high school, but there were some parts that really hurt to read at that point, and they're not getting better over time, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. How can folks find out more about you?
I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. I am found through my university. My email is very accessible. I'm happy to talk with one and all, and I'm going to admit you've intrigued me with the idea of kind of a community primer on the drug wars. So I'm going to be putting some serious thought into that in the next few weeks.
Yeah, no, let's see if we can do it. I'm not looking for you to give away the farm, if you will, because in effect it could almost be like a tease. This is what you could learn more about if, in fact, you indulge yourself in the world of academia. Ooh,
I think that it's very easy to put together an hour on that where we could cover quite a bit.
All right, let's make that a goal. If not next month, the month after, but let's make that a goal amongst friends. All right, my friend?
That sounds great.
Well, listen, I as always, my wishes to your family, the people of Deming, who we met so many of. You must say hi to my favorite Methodist minister.
I will do so.
Give him my best wishes. Is he still in residence at your community?
He still is, and in fact, I will share with you. We not only have we have services online on Sundays, but he also does devotionals through Facebook. So I'll tag you in on those.
I would love to hear him preach on a Sunday. I would absolutely love that. So please do, and as they used to say in the 19th century, please remember me to him. Okay.
I will do that, Pat.
All right, buddy. So in closing, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the Mighty Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Tonight, a remarkable 3 hours of programming. On one hand, we had a young entrepreneur here from Rhode Island talking about the importance of community and jobs and in difficult times like this of supporting folks within his community by providing a service that would facilitate in a storied city like Newport, Rhode Island, the survival, if you will, of all its fine restaurants. In the next hour, we talked to a couple of candidates, a congressional candidate from Ohio and someone who is looking to, as a young man, help head up a burgeoning urban mass transportation district. Both of them equally impressive because of their command of the issues and also a thorough understanding of the impact of our institutions, our political ones, on their constituents' lives. Completely removed from this sort of nonsense rhetoric that's tossed about by a lazy media and two parties intent on control simply for the sake of control. And then in this hour, two friends who met by chance talking about some of the most challenging issues in America today. But sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, but through mutual respect and my admiration of his academic prowess and his willingness to listen to me rattle on and prattle on for sometimes an hour and a half on a Friday night once a month. we managed to find great common ground. So we're going to sign off for tonight. We will be back tomorrow at some point. We're still sorting out the whole process here. We'll have some talk radio tomorrow. Big deal if you're a libertarian tomorrow. Our convention will be resolved at some point, I hope. And again, we will return tomorrow night to address the issues of the day. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us.
Pat, are you still there?
Yeah, hang on one second.
No problem.